Hi everyone, this is Bilo here. In this video, I'm going to be going over the biochemistry notes, or the biochemistry unit, and the carbohydrates notes. So for this part of the biochemistry unit, we're going to be talking about 4 macromolecules: carbs, nucleic acids, proteins, and lipids. And we're going to talk about each of them in terms of their structure. So what do they look like, chemically speaking? And then we're going to talk about their functions. This is also part of structure. We're going to talk about their functions, so what they do, like what's their purpose, like what's their role in living things. So we're going to start with carbohydrates. What foods contain carbs? So some of the first things that might come to mind are like bread, pasta, maybe potatoes, rice, things like oats. So these things typically contain carbohydrates, or they're high in carbs. There's a lot of other examples too. And then other foods just might contain some carbs, just not as much. So these are foods that I would say, when I say contain carbs, I mean like they're very high in carbs and like low in other things, like maybe proteins and fats. So let's talk about carbohydrates. So there are 3 main elements that make up carbs, and these will also be seen in pretty much almost all of the other macromolecules. We of course have carbon, which is our building block, and hydrogen. Remember, all of these macromolecules, or some people call them biomolecules, that we're talking about are organic, so they have carbon and hydrogen. And then glucose, or carbohydrates, also have oxygen as well. As you can see in this image here, we have the carbon, the hydrogen, and the oxygen, and it's a ring-like structure like this. I've shown this model in my classroom before. And again, most of them will be in this ring structure. As far as the ones we're going to talk about in this class, they'll be in this structure. But note that not all carbohydrates are going to have this structure, just the ones we're going to talk about in this class. So it has this ring-like, or you can say hexagon shape. And typically we're going to see the numbers of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a very specific ratio. So it's usually 1 to 1. So for every carbon and oxygen, there's usually twice the amount of hydrogen. For example, glucose is C6H12O6. You have 6 carbon and oxygen, and then twice that for the amount of hydrogen. This is, again, not all of them will be in this ratio, but most of them will be in this ratio. And also, you can usually identify if a word is related to carbs or is a carbohydrate by certain endings and beginnings, or prefixes and suffixes. So anything ending in "ose," like glucose, usually these things are carbohydrates. Like lactose is, that's in milk. That is actually a carbohydrate. And then anything that starts with glyco, like glycogen, this is a type of carb that is stored in your liver in the body. So usually those can be indicators that you're dealing with a carbohydrate. All right, so here are some examples. So here's some examples of carbohydrates. Can you identify any patterns? So here we have just the single rings, so glucose, fructose, and galactose. So these are all single ring structures. They all actually have the same formula, which is C6H12O6. It's just that these two are arranged slightly different, which like in a three-dimensional format. Like you could see here in the galactose, that difference here, and then you could see in the glucose where that oxygen is different. So three-dimensionally speaking, they are arranged a little bit differently, but they all have this formula. And then if you look over here, we can see that maltose is two glucose molecules together. Lactose is a glucose molecule and a galactose molecule together. Again, they're bonded together, chemically speaking. And then sucrose is fructose and glucose bonded together. And then we have something like starch, which is found in things like potatoes, for example, is a bunch of glucose molecules bonded together. So remember we talked about monomers and polymers? So this would be an example of a monomer. And then we put those together to get our polymers. Technically, I mean, you could kind of consider these polymers, but we're going to actually have a different name for these because there's only two things bonded together, not many like we see in starch. But you can kind of put this in that polymer category. So like I said, monomers, remember, those are, mono means one. Those are building blocks or repeating units. So for carbs, it's a simple sugar, or these three things here are examples, and we call those simple sugars, or these three things here, glucose, fructose, galactose, mono, which makes sense, saccharide. So literally mono, right, means one, right? We talked about that with the monomer. And then saccharide actually means sugar. So literally one sugar, or you can call this a simple sugar. So the monomer for carbohydrates is a monosaccharide, which you can also call simple sugar. And then these three down here would be examples. And like I said, they all have this formula, C6H12O6. They just have a different arrangement, three-dimensionally speaking. And we could put these together to get different structures or different things like polymers, or we're going to call these disaccharides, di meaning two. So what do some of these things do? So glucose, we're going to talk a lot about in this class because it's very important in the body. It's going to help us make ATP, which is energy. So this is the glucose is what you need in your body in order to do cellular respiration, in order to make energy for yourself. So you do need carbohydrates to live. It's the body's primary source of energy. However, your body can use other things like proteins and lipids as a source of energy. Those are just a little bit harder to work with. This is just so much easier for your body to use to make energy. So it goes for that first. Fructose, this would be a type of sugar you're going to find in honey, fruits, root vegetables, things like that. Again, could also be used for energy. And then galactose, that's actually found in milk. Okay, when you combine galactose and glucose together, you get lactose, which is what you find in milk. Milk also has a lot of other things in it, like proteins and lipids, which are fats, but it also has lactose. Milk is, that's what we feed to infants, to babies, because it has basically all of these nutrients in them. It has carbs, proteins, and lipids, which are fats. All right, so like I was saying, we can put monosaccharides together, which are the monomers for carbohydrates, to make polymers, or we could call them polysaccharides. And again, we're going to do that through dehydration synthesis, which remember is when we remove the water to create that bond between two things. So a monosaccharide is one sugar. That could be glucose, fructose, or galactose. A disaccharide is when you put two monomers together of carbohydrates, or two monosaccharides. And that could be lactose, which we talked about is glucose and galactose bonded together. You can have maltose, that's in molasses. And then you have sucrose, which is your typical table sugar. And then you can have, before we get to like polysaccharides, you can have what's called an oligosaccharide, which is just a few saccharides or a few monosaccharides bonded together. So 3 to 9. So like this one has 4. And then you have what we're going to focus on a lot, which is the polysaccharides. And this is many sugars bonded together. So this is going to be your starch. So things in potatoes, rice, and wheat. It's a bunch of glucose molecules bonded together. You're going to have glycogen. This is what you store in your liver to save for later while you're using the other glucose in your body. Cellulose, this is a structure in plants. It's actually what makes up their cell wall. Remember, all cells have a cell membrane, but not all cells have a cell wall. So cellulose is actually a carbohydrate that makes up the cell wall in plant cells. And then there's also this, how you say it, chitin is how you say that. And that's the exoskeleton in bugs. If you've ever stepped on a bug and you've heard that crunch sound, that's the sound of the chitin. Now, the main function of carbohydrates, this is the main one, it's a quick source of energy. And again, we're going to talk about how we use glucose in the body to make ATP later on, which is the energy currency of the body. It's the first thing the body uses because it's the most easy to process. You can use other things as a source, like proteins and fats, but this is going to be the primary source because it's the easiest for the body to break down, chemically speaking, and use to make ATP. Other functions, so like I said, in humans or animals in general, we can store glycogen in the liver. So that can be later converted into glucose and then used for energy. Like I said, structure in plants, the cellulose makes up the cell wall, and structure in bugs, chitin. And then kind of analogous to this, plants will store starch to use later as a source of energy. And then this was the video that you watched for homework, how do carbs impact your health? Again, you need carbohydrates to live. Like you need it to make ATP. It's just that eating a lot of certain type of carbohydrates can lead to possibly certain health issues as discussed in that video. But please note, like, there's a lot of things that can impact your health. Genetics can be a component, other things in your life or your environment as well. But you do need carbohydrates in order to make ATP because the body's going to use this first because, like I said, chemically speaking, it is the easiest thing to break down and convert into ATP. The process of converting like proteins or lipids, that's a little bit different of a process and can take a little bit longer sometimes.